There is one perfect moment between clear skies and storm, between calm and tempest, where there is found the matchless feeling of transition. It is in this moment that is found the zenith of Remedy's level design. The sound of oncoming thunder, the blue skies subtly fading to gray, the warm winds whistling through the trees. In this place I can feel it all, even smell the grass and lake. Technology has moved forward, time has advanced, and the ability to create realistic scenes has improved. But to me, nothing evokes this unique sensation better. These indulgences into singular and incredibly realized digital installations are what Wake does best. And every time I play this game, I feel compelled to just sit and enjoy every single one of them. This is Alan Wake at its strongest. This is why I love this game. Moments such as this are hardly the only reason to love this incredibly unique title. To understand it to its fullest, let's go back to 2005's Finland. The story of Alan Wake starts in 2005, when development began in earnest after Max Payne 2's release. Remedy sought to create something that diverged from Max Payne 2 as much as possible, envisioning Wake as an open-world game. Development saw Wake originally more as a survival game, where players would craft safe havens in the wilderness during the day, in preparation for nightly assaults of the darkness. Work on Wake in this mode went on for 3 years before it became clear to Remedy that the tension they wanted to create with their psychological thriller atmosphere was incompatible with the freedom and amorphous tone created by an open-world setting. I think a quote from one of the developers says it best. Quote, "You're doing it wrong if the player shows up with a monster truck to a love scene." I love that they understood this. So many modern open-world game stories clash immensely with the player-driven sandboxes of their setting, where at any moment the player is likely to do whatever is most absurd. On top of that, it is essentially impossible to have a tense, time-sensitive narrative inside such a setting, and it really does show immense foresight to see this before the game came out. Now then began the work of finding what game Alan Wake was going to be. The self-appointed and named Sauna team sought to put Wake into a sweatbox until all of its impurities were drained out. Salvaging as much as possible from the open-world design, the team reforged and refocused Wake into introspection. There were so many pressures after the release of Payne 2, so many calls for a Remedy-made Max Payne 3, but that wasn't where their vision led them, where their story was to be continued. Those energies, those anxieties of creation and killing their past work is what forged Wake, and the uncertain darkness of an unknown future tempered it. There's more to explore here, so much to break down and analyze. But let's move on to the next phase. Before the release of Alan Wake came the herald of Bright Falls. Alan Wake did not start at its own beginning, but found its first steps into darkness inside its prequels, the Bright Falls miniseries. And I feel this series works quite well as an appetizer to the main dish, as Bright Falls is best experienced without the context of Wake. Without the more concrete explanations provided by the game, the series works very well to capture the mysterious feeling of something like Twin Peaks. The brief series chronicles the arrival of a reporter, Jake Fisher, to the town of Bright Falls, where Alan Wake is set to arrive shortly. Jake's struggles very much mirror that of Wake, his relationship with his wife strained and quickly trapped in the mire of the mysterious small town. Much of the style of the series longs to emulate that of Lynch's Peaks, with its understated scenes and quirky weirdness of its characters, with a special focus on background characters who act in an uncanny way, just south of normal. Much of the scenes and story are presented without context, expecting the watcher to avidly speculate about its every aspect. This was when Lost Fever was in full effect, Bright Falls airing only 2 weeks before the finale of that show, and this sort of mystery boxing was only too common. What plot there is focuses on Jake's descent into darkness, with his reporting job going south, and him slowly starting to hallucinate and lose time. Eventually, he reaches the point where he cannot even leave the town, as the only way out is shrouded in darkness. The reasons for this are obtuse without the context of the game, and a creepy atmosphere is slowly built up competently, with many scenes hinting at the wrongness of the town and the people in it. This one too quiet. That one too loud. So many broken lights. Why? If you've already played Wake, you can no doubt answer many of these questions, and the perspective this series provides to Wake is quite interesting. We're allowed to see what the descent into a puppet of darkness would look like, seeing both the main character and many of the townsfolk in early stages of transformation. I especially like the scene with the woman throwing rocks at a light post. It's so perfectly evocative of the atmosphere the series aims to create, while also expanding upon the lore of Wake. I'll give props to Bright Falls, as its mysteries mostly make sense in the setting of the work it's promoting, and does meaningfully enhance the experience of playing Alan Wake. The series culminates with Jake finally being completely taken and lost to darkness, not afforded the same luxuries as Wake, who drives into town ignorant of poor Jake's struggles. Finally, we are greeted with our protagonist, Alan Wake, roused from a nightmare into the much-hyped town of Bright Falls. Wake is a deeply troubled man, having found himself with a severe case of writer's block after completing his most recent novel, Sudden Stop, the final book in the Alex Casey series. Alex Casey is maybe unsurprisingly a hard-boiled detective, his wife and child dead alone in a city out for his blood. But now, he has joined his wife and child in the sleep of death. Yes, Wake has killed his cash cow and companion in fiction, opting to move on to new projects rather than spend any more time in Casey's noir New York. If you've watched my video on Max Payne, and I would recommend that you do, this should all sound only too familiar, and deliberately so, as Wake is meant in many ways to mirror the struggle of Remedy after the production of Max Payne. They have both embarked upon a journey into unknown darkness, their futures made uncertain by their own hand. Wake's travels will only be a little more fraught with dangers than Remedy. The woman that roused Alan from his slumbers is wife, Alice Wake. She is Alan's muse and light in his life, but ever more begrudgingly so, as Alan has grown increasingly irascible in his creative slump. She's always believed in Alan, seen the best side of him, and wants only the best for him. But what can she do when Alan doesn't want help, when he's only too happy to languish in darkness? It was her idea to come to Bright Springs, to break Alan of the curse afflicting him and restore him to the man she knows he can be. Unfortunately and unbeknownst to her, however, this will only drive Wake away from her further and deeper than he ever thought possible into his own self-made abyss. The landing of the ferry and arrival of the Wakes into the town is the first of many relaxed opportunities we will have to soak in the atmosphere, the vibrant setting Remedy have lovingly crafted. Filled with opportunities to take part in the unfolding stage, Remedy expertly gives us the opportunity to feel the part of Alan, talking to the locals while boats land and trains clack across their tracks. We even have an opportunity to meet with one of our future antagonists, an innocent-seeming, rude hunter, and are even treated to the sight of the world-famous Deer Fest float. The voice acting and back and forth between all the actors in this scene is well-timed, giving us the briefest but brightest of window into their personage. After this, we move straight into the next banger of a scene at the Oh Dear Diner. An appearance extremely and purposefully similar to Twin Peaks' Double R Diner, Wake utilizes the tropes established by that show to quickly set up Rose and Rusty, a well-meaning, if obsessed waitress with a kindly, lonely park ranger. These people might seem uninteresting or outright unlikable, but Remedy will expertly weave even these small side characters into nuanced and relatable figures in a most intriguing way. For now, turn your eyes to Odin and Thor, two of the most obviously interesting and amusing citizens of Bright Falls. They're escaped mental patients from a local institution and rock music enthusiasts. The dynamic between them is absolutely adorable. Odin longing only to hear one more time how the lime was put into the coconut, and Thor rebuking him for his poor taste, instantly endears you to these two lovable madmen. Honestly, who could refuse the god of gods his coconut? Finally, there is Cynthia Weaver, aka the Lamp Lady. If the rest of the scene wasn't laying on the Twin Peaks influence heavily enough, most people will instantly recognize the reference to the ambassador of Twin Peaks, the Log Lady. Here, Cynthia's connection to lights is no less relevant and no less obtuse to the new player. The Lamp Lady is the trope that is stolen most brazenly, without a doubt, as she is used almost to the exact same point and purpose as her log-bearing counterpart. All this being said, every inch of this diner drowns the player in atmosphere and familiarizes them with just what kind of story is going to happen, all the while instilling in them questions and mysteries that will persist throughout the game. Remedy cannot stop showing their absolute mastery of their digital craft, shattering any distance between Alan and the player, allowing us to completely immerse ourselves in their environments. And this is only the second of so many amazing set pieces. The encounter with Cynthia is Wake's last chance to turn back. Her sage eldritch warnings of darkness unheeded, Wake is guided by a woman clad in funeral garb to an impossible place outside of time. Diver's Isle, a small bastion of the living amidst a sea of unknowable depths. Alice reveals her intentions to Wake, that she brought him here to guide him out of his creative purgatory. Alan responds only with anger, refusing to see her actions in the unyielding light that she sees his. And so, Alice is stolen by the darkness, by Wake's unwillingness to look inward or move forward. This darkness is made literal in the form of an ancient Lovecraftian force embodying an old woman, capable of making the creative intent of people into reality. Wake is not just willing to let Alice go, however, and dives into the depths of this eldritch abyss in a futile attempt to retrieve her. Alan wakes a week later. No memory of the intervening time, but lucky for him, he has left himself the key to unraveling the truth. Manuscript pages penned by him that describe the future, the past, and the present beyond his eyes. These pages have been scattered all throughout the world in places both obvious and obscure, and provide valuable insight into every scene, character, and event. This is exemplified by Rose, who received only the most basic of traits in the diner, but one of the first pages you can find reads thusly.
Rose knew she had been gushing, but right now she didn't care. As far as she was concerned, her brief meeting with Alan Wake was literally the high point of her life. She watched as he got in the car with his wife. She was pretty, confident, at ease with Wake. Not like Rose. They were perfect for each other. She'd have given anything to be called their friend.
One of several pages pertaining to Rose that you will stumble upon, it shows a vulnerability and childishness to her, portraying her as someone deeply longing for connection with someone she respects, but lacking in the social understanding to do so. That just couldn't be communicated in the brief window allowed her there, and all that packed into only 20 seconds of dialogue. While many games include audio logs that in function are not dissimilar to these, here the pages work so much better at maintaining the fabric of the world. In games that include these logs, it does come off as odd what people say into their audio journals, or that even people keep so many of them at all. But here those concerns are irrelevant. The framing device of a knockoff Stephen King novel fits naturally into the narrative, allowing writers greater freedom to explore characters from literary perspectives and elaborate events not witnessed by humans. This car crash is also where the player is finally let loose to explore the game's systems, free of oversight. The darkness has taken numerous hapless campers, loggers, and hunters to throw as pawns against Wake, and the game features a unique mechanic for combating them. Enemies are shrouded in a shield of darkness, unable to be harmed by traditional forces until this darkness is burned off by a flashlight or light-emitting explosions from items like flare guns and propane containers, which can undo them in one fell blast. Aiming is smooth. Reloading goes faster when you mash the reload button, providing wonderful feedback for a thing the player is already inclined to do anyways. Weapons fire faster when the trigger is pulled at the right rhythm. Enemies can be stunned by focusing your light on them, or repelled entirely by utilizing flares. Shots from traditional firearms allow you to stun enemies and stop attacks, and well-timed dodges can allow Wake to ignore damage entirely. These mechanics, all put together, combine into a system that is much more deep and fun than it appears at first. While admittedly balance is often thrown off by resources being just a little too available, when the game desires to press the player, it can do so with incredible competency. Wake might not be the dynamic and acrobatic Payne, but the mechanics here create a pleasing rhythm, rewarding the player's ability to manage themselves carefully under pressure. I can't say that Alan Wake often accomplishes outright horror especially well, but every time enemies near, the winds of the dark presence blow through the trees. Enemies infest every corner of the woods, if not in truth, then in your mind. The tension created by the tendrils of darkness winding through the game's many scenic trails really do make you feel constantly on edge. Breaking these combat sections are a mix of radio segments featuring the charismatic Pat Maine broadcasting both day and night. But the real star of these breaks are the wildly entertaining Night Springs, an utterly unsettled reference to the town in the main game. After all, night springs when the bright falls. Finally, after Max Payne's many slideshows, we're treated to some live-action stage play, imitating Twilight Zone episodes shot on a budget of no dollars and written by a random member of the SCP Wiki. Night Springs isn't nearly as relevant to the game's themes as Address Unknown is to Max Payne. I do, however, find them infinitely entertaining, which is exactly what they're meant to do. After all, if you want to stop the player in their tracks and pace out a level, what better way than to entertain them? Wake benefits massively from its origins as an open-world game. The levels feel exceptionally open, and as you go along to future levels, you will see many of the landmarks you'll have grown familiar with. Pat's radio tower blinking red and tall on top of the highest peak comes to mind in particular, as it can be seen in almost every level. Each place you visit feels so much more real when it tangibly connects to the wider town of Bright Falls, and its setting in the scenic Northwest is much more convincing with the sense of scale afforded by the expansive map. Immersion. It's at the core of what makes Wake such a singular title, and the misstep of forging Wake too large the first time, but then narrowing what the player experiences, is integral to it feeling realer than even real open-world games. I neglected to mention Carl Stuckey earlier, but he is the man Wake was originally meant to meet for a real cabin before being waylaid by the darkness. But now we meet him again as a puppet of that darkness. I both like and hate that he recurs here, as it does make the town feel smaller and more connected to see a familiar face as the antagonist. However, it does stretch the believability of the fiction that after you defeat him, or for that matter after the darkness took him, that the town wouldn't be torn apart by a central pillar of the community going missing. This is doubly true given the Twin Peaks influences, where the central conceit of that piece of media was that the death of a single woman tore the town just like this apart. Wake just doesn't take the time it should to linger on some of its characters and rushes forward to its conclusion. This is, at the end of the day, a story about Wake, however, and he escapes the clutches of the darkness to find himself flashing back to the past, having just finished his most recent book. This is the earliest that we see Wake, and he seems devoid of much of the frustration and angst we see him exhibiting through the rest of the narrative. I mean, you can even see Remedy's ending to Max Payne here. Wake interacts positively with Alice and seems genuinely happy. But why? What changed? He has just finished the aforementioned Alex Casey novel, Sunstop, and it is this that heralds the beginning of his decline. It seems when working on Casey, he had clear direction, enthusiasm, and confidence, but after completing it, all he knew is that he wanted to make something that wasn't Alex Casey. Max Payne and Casey the Same were unable to bear the themes their writers wanted to put upon them. of a bending reality changing as its protagonist did. But these wordsmiths did not know how to express those ideas. They did not know who or what would be a suitable vehicle to bear such concepts. Looking back on Casey, though, Remedy and Wake both believe they didn't do anything but adhere to tropes, translate aspects of other people's works into his own. They aren't real writers, only able to lead stories to their most cliché conclusions, themes as thin as paper. All of this is very reminiscent of how Remedy states feeling after completing Max Payne 2, and the arduous development process that Wake went through, as it initially felt very aimless. The only concrete aspect of Wake's design, that it wasn't Max Payne. So then, this is the beginning of Wake's and Remedy's nightmare, when they are cast into the darkness of the unknown self, and as usual for Wake, this is a little more literal. Wake finds himself already in a city like his own, but frightfully unfamiliar. He finds himself in Max's own noir New York.
A winter storm warning is in effect in the whole tri-state area, as both freezing rain and heavy snowfall continue. Many roadways are already closed, and people are advised to stay indoors. The severe blizzard has ravaged New York for 3 days now, with no end in sight.
The continuing freezing rain and heavy snowfall have necessitated a winter storm warning in the entire tri-state area. People are advised to stay indoors, as many roadways are already closed, and city officials are not expecting snow crews to keep up with the weather. We're now on the 3rd day of the blizzard, and the weather is not expected to clear up anytime soon.
Nothing for Wake will ever be the same, as from this moment on he is a part of fiction. Whatever he was before, he is now pixels and electricity. Wake might want to stay in this rare dream not turned nightmare, but he cannot. He must go back to the Bright Falls Sheriff Department, Barry Wheeler, and Sheriff Sarah Breaker. Barry is the kind of person that could only exist in fiction. Alan just so happened to become one of the most prolific writers of the 2000s, and Barry, his childhood friend, just so happened to be a big-time agent. The contrivance on display with his career path is only equaled by his snide joviality. I should hate this comic relief sidekick, but I find him oddly endearing. I do think this mostly comes down to how good a foil to Alan he turns out to be. Alan is unnecessarily dour and kind of an asshole, whereas Barry does come across as a legitimately good friend who is unnaturally naive and enthusiastic. He just has no filter or self-awareness.
The Bright Falls General Store is now my favorite place in the entire world. See this headlamp? It's like a superpower. I can just look at one of those things and they die. It's my flaming eye of Mordor. I wish I didn't say that.
Breaker is just Sheriff Truman's daughter. If you haven't seen Twin Peaks, she's affable, intuitive, and knows more about what's going on than she lets on. Naturally, this leads her to believe Wake more than most. She suffers, however, from the game's brevity, as it seems the game wanted to have her play a larger part in things and explore her more, but she's mostly limited to the sidelines, serving as little more than someone for you to recognize from Twin Peaks. It is in this police station that the game's most unfortunate diversion occurs. Wake receives a letter from someone claiming to have kidnapped Alice. He should immediately see through this ruse, even with what little he remembers of the past week, since he knows, or should know, that the darkness took his wife. But he fails to do so, and so we are treated to an enormous filler arc, wasting the player's time running around doing almost literally nothing. The kidnapper demands the whole manuscript that Wake has penned, which of course he doesn't have, and it all ends with him being unceremoniously killed by the darkness. An utterly pointless plot cul-de-sac that I've abbreviated enormously goes on for 3 whole chapters of a game with only 6. I can't say that I hate every moment of where this plot goes, however, as it does give some time to slowly explore the beautiful Washington parks of the game's setting. So much of these locations still hold their scenic appeal and are riddled with relics of both the national parks and Bright Falls itself. Massive redwoods, abandoned logging camps, and more provide much-needed literal color to an age when Gears of War and many alike influenced game development to a muted set of gray and brown tones. The setting is just so well chosen to easily allow the writers to paint incredible detail onto the town of Bright Falls. One of my favorite is a cutting of the aforementioned redwood that chronicles the dates of important Bright Falls events to the rings on the tree's cutting. This is just the perfect interactable to show how much Remedy cared about and understood in their own minds the setting, and the way to create unique set pieces to explore Bright Falls with flavors so much better executed than another audio log. The great outdoors isn't the only place where Remedy poured attention and detail, as when Rose, under the influence of the darkness, claims to have this much sought-after manuscript, Wake heads to a humble trailer park. Surely here, in one of the most mundane places, Remedy must fail to craft a worthwhile scene. Yet again, their attention to detail and creativity make this into one more spectacle. The first thing that will immediately grab your attention is the sailboat in the center of the park. This out-of-place pleasure craft adds that signature Remedy flair. But that's hardly all. In our fight earlier with Stucky, he went on and on about Randy's hot dogs with their big belly burster, which you can actually find on the menu in this park. It is utterly serene here. The slow sounds of a Bigfoot hitting a tree in the distance, calming and rhythmic, while also being a portent of the foes Wake will no doubt face when night comes. Ravens, indicators of the Dark Presence activity, infest the trailers, reminding us of the unfortunate circumstances that brought us here. In this idyllic community, Barry explains the past of the town. Before Wake, there was another writer and poet named Thomas Zane, who roused the darkness from its slumber, and his girlfriend Barbara Yeager befell the same fate as Alice. He took the same path as Wake, penning a story that he might bring Barbara back to life, but his wish was corrupted. Like a monster from a monkey's paw, Barbara's body came back, only to serve as host to the Dark Presence. This also works to draw a parallel between Wake and Max Payne. Just as Payne was trapped in a series of endless cycles, watching the women he cared about die time and again, so is Wake. That takes us to poor Rose, a woman filled with such longing and loneliness, now is filled only with darkness. Her mind left shattered, only able to repeat her catchphrases from the Oh Dear Diner. Waking from Rose's drugging, we're treated to a view of her room, childishly decorated with a mobile above her bed. All of this twists the knife so much more. She really was so innocent, so alone. Now she is just a casualty in Wake's story to save his wife. I do wish the game took more time like this to pause and look at the consequences of Wake's writing. There's a lot of power in the fact that everything that happens in this town is a direct result of Wake's own script. Everyone that dies, everyone who is broken by the darkness, is done so because Wake wrote it as such. But moments to reflect on this are seldom, and times such as this, when it feels appropriate to grieve, are fleeting. We have talked at length about this darkness up till now, but what is it? We can gain significant insight into its identity by what it allows people to do, which is to bring into reality manifestations of their own creativity. Since the writers of Alan Wake are not cowards and therefore used no subtext, this marks the darkness as a place from which creative ideas are drawn. As seen in the portion where Alice is kidnapped, however, it seems to gain strength when Alan lashes at Alice, and surely all ideas must not come from such cruelty. It is then the unknown self, the parts of ourselves which we have not yet been able to understand, but through the light of creativity and self-expression may bring to the surface and incorporate more fully into ourselves. Uncontrolled darkness, as seen in the aforementioned outburst, however, is almost purely destructive. But it is where Alan found himself after the creation of his final work. He had taken everything he knew of himself, everything he wanted from the outset to express and could clearly see within himself, and put it out for the world to see. But he was a writer now. He wanted to prove to himself he could make a work greater than Casey, that he could rise above what he had crafted in his early days. But he would have to look deep within himself, struggle against forces unknown, both from without and within. It would nearly drive him into deep madness. Deeper into madness is exactly where Alan has ended up after his pointless pursuit of the ill-titled kidnapper ended with him falling off of a cliff. He starts this time in a clinic for the creatively challenged, where Dr. Emil Hartman insists he has spent the last couple weeks here after the death of his wife drove him into a psychotic episode. I won't drone on especially long about how wonderful this scene is, as it is where we started this particular dive into Wake. I will merely reiterate that this scene of serene beauty of the oncoming storm in this digital installation is positively spectacular. This thing about Wake being here as the death of his wife, it's all a lie, of course, isn't it? Isn't it most likely that this explanation is true, that Hartman is telling us the truth we don't want to hear? The game has conditioned us against him, if for no other reason than we want to get back out to exploring the wilderness and pointing our flashlight and pistol at bad guys. But it all lines up. And it would be only too easy to chart out how this had been a delusion induced by a mix of emotional and physical trauma. No doubt there are fan theories that do exactly that. Hell, it would be only too easy to imagine even Max Payne is a delusion of Alan Wake. Maybe the reason he saw himself as insane was Alan trying to wake himself up, remind himself that he is trapped in a maze of his own subconscious. I jest, but simultaneously wait for the All Remedy Games Are a Delusion of Alan Wake video that will inevitably be made by someone. This section also has my favorite pointless side character, a Remedy employee slowly being driven mad by the demands of various departments.
You can't hurt a nightmare because all dreams are only imagination. They're only in your head and they're not there when you wake up. So you can't wake up because I'm in charge now and I don't want to disappear. My nightmare is the publisher people who want to make a contribution so they can say they made a contribution. And then we end up with mullets in there because they think mullets are funny, but it wasn't supposed to be about mullets. And now it's about mullets. And when it's in slow motion, they call it mullet time because the numbers came back from marketing that mullet time is the hook we needed to go big in the target demographic. And they're not even kidding. They say it all like serial killers with straight faces and smiles. My nightmare is the writers who want to make everything from the characters to the toasters talk all the time and express their feelings so they won't shut up. And the writers won't shut up either because they have feelings too. And I have to listen to them because they're not scared of me. And everyone should just shut up. Shut up. Shut up.
The reason for this diversion is made clear after a talk with the Anderson brothers when they give you a manuscript page that describes how Hartman was the one that coaxed the original writer, Thomas Zane, into his musings. Wake must walk the path of Zane, must fall in exactly the same loops he did, because he cannot escape the cycles, cannot escape Thomas, whose name means twin. But at the same time, he must. Alan must find a way to break the wheel, to be neither Thomas nor Max all over again, and Thor and Odin say they left a note that describes just how he can accomplish this. There's one point I want to make before going on, however, and that is mostly just remarking on how gleefully Wake kills Hartman. He gives that fellow a smile as he lets the darkness take him, and keep in mind this is the second time he made this decision, as he wrote the scenario into existence to begin with. Obviously, Wake has his own darkness to overcome. This leads us on to what is one of the most iconic moments of Alan Wake, and the genesis of what will become a hallmark of Remedy, a massive confrontation set to energetic rock music performed by Poets of the Fall. Poets are the band actually behind many of the earworms featured in Remedy's games, and here they don the mask of the old gods of Asgard. This confrontation isn't hard or tense, with plentiful supplies and numerous tools at your disposal to dispatch your foes. But it is one of the last moments of levity before the game enters its final stretch. It might be wildly out of tone for the otherwise gritty and horror-focused Wake, but I don't mind Remedy's decision to include it because sometimes you just have to throw your hands up and say, it's cool, so it's going in. I like so many details about the Andersons revealed here, that they held wild parties where they ran naked through the fields, that the darkness got her ravens from Odin, that Odin literally cut out his eye to conform more to his namesake, and, the thing relevant to Wake, that they made moonshine with the water from Cauldron Lake. This ingredient is apparently incredibly heady and induces powerful dreams. It also has the odd side effect of making Wake and Barry's voice actors sound like they've never heard a drunk person in their entire life.
I'm sorry about this. No, seriously, because I know we don't get along, but we're gonna find her, right? And even though you're a crazy bastard, I'm gonna stick by you, no matter what, ever, Al. Sure, like a brother.
I'm a writer, goddammit.
Correct.
If I just wanted to, I could write 10 books a year.
In Wake's moonshine-induced dreams, he sees how he spent his lost week typing his manuscript to bring Alice back, but how the darkness kept warping his book to make itself more and more powerful. The only thing that Wake believed could stop the darkness was writing himself into the narrative, so Zane saves Wake and gives him his week to put things right. Again, we parallel Remedy. Having seen no escape for their own creative darkness, they wrote themselves into the story as Wake, because they didn't know where else to go, didn't see any way out but to make it about themselves. Of course, this wasn't the only boon found by the Anderson farm. Wake also learned that Cynthia Weaver, the Lantern Lady, holds the key to ending this, entrusted to her by Zane. After managing to track down the Lantern Lady to her home at a power plant, she reveals that she was much like Rose, someone obsessed with Zane, but never fated to be with him, and ultimately taken and damaged by the darkness. She even leaves graffiti around the town, wistfully imagining the world where she and Thomas Zane had loved one another. And it might be cruel, but Zane saw her as the perfect one to carry out his will, no matter how many years it took. She is keeping the perfect weapon against the darkness, the clicker, in a place called the well-lit room. The clicker was referred to earlier in the apartment scene with Wake, where he told Alice it was something his mother gave to him, because he used to be afraid of the dark, and it would chase that darkness away. But when he finds the clicker in that well-lit room, along with it is a page describing how his mother gave it to him. Why and how? There's no way he could have written a page about his own childhood, after all, so this must have been written by Zane. I feel this ties into the game's opening thesis, that the unanswered mystery is what stays with you the longest, that closure is the antithesis to good storytelling, and without some concepts that lack clear answers, the story would be a failure. Now, are there very plausible explanations for this? Yes. Am I going to go into them? No. I feel it would be disingenuous to the themes to explain this, and you can go find this information on your own if you're so inclined. Ultimately, I love this bit of legitimate mystery that the game clearly understands but has no intention of explaining to the player. It is the most accidentally, perfectly Lynchian thing in this entire Twin Peaks fan game. And with that, it is time for Wake to make his final push to save Alice and prove he can write a conclusion to a story that shows he can overcome his previous works to stand on his own. His final push will see him descend into the depths of Cauldron Lake, into the home of darkness, where words may literally be made manifest into whatever their writer can conjure. We also see Mr. Scratch for the first time. The game says we should not pay attention to him, and for now we must oblige. Wake has already written his way to the cabin. All he needs to do is make it into the darkness and use his MacGuffin to have a chance to save himself. Here he realizes what he needs to do to actually save Alice. Zane wrote Barbara back with no plan, but Wake will thrust himself into the depths of his own darkness to save her. Wake isn't just Remedy, but Max as well, and all three of them are trapped in the same story happening over and over. He wrote a story that trapped himself in a web of his own cliches. He had to find a way to escape, to be more than a collection of tropes. Wake doesn't just redeem himself with his sacrifice, but his writers as well. After two painfully banal narratives, they finally wrote a story where the love interest doesn't die at the end, but more importantly, that doesn't neatly wrap everything up, that intentionally doesn't give the audience closure. For this reason, many no doubt found the conclusion to Alan Wake unsatisfying. They did not want to live in a world that didn't neatly wrap itself up, but I love it. As I said, conclusions are an anathema to good mysteries, and if the game ended with anything but ambiguity, it would have shown that it learned nothing from the media that inspired it. Alan Wake improves on its predecessors in many ways, finally managing to tell a story that's worth listening to, even if most of the time it has the subtlety of an average Garth Marenghi episode. Where it really shines is its environments, though. I really can't speak enough to how much each scene is so incredibly well crafted, much of it coming down to just how well the sound is engineered. Every calm stage oozes atmosphere that you can really lose yourself in, and the pacing is spectacular, each distraction paced perfectly to pause and calm the player's nerves. The characters are wonderfully quirky, and thanks to the manuscript pages, afforded the depth rarely seen in video games. It's all just so amazing, and every time I decide to play through the game again, there are so many moments that I just can't wait to experience once again. Unfortunately, that glowing praise does not extend to the post-game DLC in American Nightmare, but this is a complete critique from beginning to end, so let's get into it. Wake was released in May of 2010, and by July, the first piece of DLC, The Signal, was out, released free to those who pre-ordered the game. And boy, does it feel like it was made in a hurry, and for very little money, except for what Verizon put into it. That's right, Verizon. Just check out this ad for the very great Verizon GPS.
The GPS system was working. I hadn't expected that. Hello?
I'm trying to reach you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
A GPS that works in supernatural darkness. Sign me up. There's a fair amount of product placement in the main game, but none this brazen. As a matter of fact, it's hard to think of any product placement in any game quite as brazen as that. If it's any comfort, the batteries are no longer branded as Energizer, so at least it has that going for it. Basically, everything is made from reused asset, and the whole thing wraps up in about an hour with very little narrative. The game might not start out on a great note, but it isn't all bad, as it does at least try to describe and create a unique atmosphere. Wake has completed his work, Departure, but now what? After any great endeavor is completed, there's always a feeling of emptiness. The best way I've ever heard it described is that whether you succeed in a dream or fail to achieve it, the result is the same. You are left bereft of a dream. That is where The Signal takes place, in the fetid afterbirth of a job well done, quietly and sadly wondering what to do next. Wake wanders in the darkness, unable to go anywhere, and by the end, all he manages to do is find himself broken and useless on the floor. And that's a very appropriate place for this DLC that does nothing and goes nowhere. The Writer is the much more expansive of the two DLCs, released in October of the same year. While it still primarily reuses assets, it does so in a much more creative way. It fully breaks down the world into a wild dreamscape of impossible landscapes floating upon nothing. Tremendous mazes and a wheel of familiar architecture. One highlight for me was finding what the developers thought of all this. An Easter egg describes these sojourns as endless streams of nonsense, forgettable filler texts that pique the curiosity but explain nothing. If that was included as some mild discontent about having to make this DLC for a story-based game just because it was the market trend at the time, it's quite apt. After all, both of these DLCs cannot advance the plot. They serve as nothing but filler between Alan Wake and the, at the time, theoretical Alan Wake 2. In the end, they feel like works that no one should have asked for, and that no one working on really wanted to make, or, even if they did want to make them, had not the time nor budget to forge them into something worthwhile. Alan Wake's American Nightmare was released in 2012 as an Xbox Live arcade game. Its original scope was intentionally very limited to a series of survival challenges. Whether the intention from here was to include mild narrative elements, or if what we got was always the plan is unclear. But regardless, this focus on gameplay does result in significantly cleaned up mechanics. Movement is snappier, sprinting is less limited, and Wake has numerous new weapons he can use to fight the Taken. Flare capacity is significantly reduced, making the number of get-out-of-jail-free cards the player has access to far more limited. There are new enemy types that playfully change up the way you interact with the game's mechanic, splitting off in response to light instead of being weakened by it. Giant spiders have no shroud of weakness but appear in huge numbers, playing well with your new arsenal of fully automatic weapons. While all these improvements to gameplay are welcome, American Nightmare feels much the cheap TV tie-in to a mildly successful movie franchise. The story section of the game sees Alan chasing down Mr. Scratch, his dangerous double spawned from darkness and controlled by one of the myriad entities in its depths. He manages to do this through a loophole of the darkness. He's still not permitted to escape it, but he just so happens to have written an episode of Night Falls back in the day that exactly follows the situation he is in now, and he writes himself into that. If that seems a little too coincidental for you, you ain't seen nothing yet. The pacing of the early segments of the game flows well and reintroduce the slow drip of radio show world building, expanding on the events that have happened between Alan Wake and this with Barry and Alice. In this case, I vastly prefer these to the TV segments, all of which are just Mr. Scratch doing something nefarious to some innocent person. While there's a lot of potential in these, they all drag on just a little too long, killing the tension they should imbue in the player, and after the first two, you've pretty much seen them all anyways. Everyone follows the same formula. Scratch monologues and tells you how much you suck and how great he is. Shows something that seems innocent and then murders someone. The first segment of this game really broke me. I mean, it's just... The whole premise of the original game was that Wake had to write a narrative that made sense within its genre, that one action had to flow naturally into another consequence. But the first thing he writes about in this game is bringing down a satellite to destroy a place of power for the darkness by playing rock music and lighting some barricades. While this does mark the genre the game is transitioning to, Pulp Fiction, even within that genre this makes absolutely no sense. Even if the satellite does come down, it feels like there had to be some sort of consequences for that. If this is Pulp Fiction, where's the alien monstrosity? The microorganism made macroorganism by space magic radiation crawling out of the satellite. Where is the story about the satellite crash going? Nowhere. Nowhere is the answer. An absurd thing happens because it fits what Wake needs to happen, and that's it. And that more or less sets the tone for American Nightmare. That things just kind of happen without much explanation. The biggest flaw of Nightmare, though, is its insistence upon getting the most out of its assets. You will experience every level not once or twice, but 3 times. That's right. Get to the end and Mr. Scratch will tell you your Alice is in another castle, and you have to do it all over again. It isn't exactly the same each time, but it's very damn close. And that's when the tedium really starts to kick in, when you see that satellite fall down on that oil well for the third time. This is exasperated, as you don't even really understand what you're trying to do outside of catch the signal, which I thought we already did, and defeat Mr. Scratch, but the whys of your failures are hidden behind the next loop. If there's something I like about this DLC, though, it's what Mr. Scratch represents. Mr. Scratch is explained to have split off of Wake, because some Wake had to stay existing in the real world. And when Scratch went to stand in for him, he became the incarnation of the worst possible stories about Wake. Scratch absorbs every torrid tale and tabloid lie into one person. If this story about the perception of reality getting writ onto something sounds familiar, then you've likely played Control. And what we see here is Wake no longer being a suitable vehicle for the themes Remedy wants to discuss. This then is the death knell for Alan Wake, and the biggest indicator of why Alan Wake 2 never happened. Remedy seems to follow this structure of creating a thing with a great passion for an idea. But then when it comes to what to do next, thus far they have made nothing so large as to accommodate every wild idea they can conceive. Maybe Control will be that game that will finally get a real sequel, as it is a very broad concept which could accommodate any number of ideas. Or maybe not. Time will tell. Either way, Scratch is ultimately undone by Alice's new film that shows Wake in the best possible light. The perfect counterpoint to the core of Scratch's existence. And maybe, after his defeat, Wake has a moment of calm with his love. Or maybe this is all just a story. Who can tell? Either way, Remedy showed they had outgrown Wake, and it was time to move on. Wake was a risk, a departure from the sure thing of Max Payne into the unknown, but something I think Remedy felt they had to make to be true to themselves. It is a work made absolutely unique by its failures, and I love every second of it. It says something powerful about the work that even to this day it has its adherents clamoring for a sequel. And while I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to it per se if Remedy had an excellent idea, I say Wake is perfect just as it is. Nothing is required. None of its mysteries really need to be answered. Closure doesn't need to be reached for Wake to be complete. Quite the opposite, in fact. After all, the unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and it is what we will remember in the end. Thank you for watching. So that is Alan Wake. I really love this game, and I really hope that I was able to communicate a lot of why I have such passion for this title. It really is a game that is, to me, stood the test of time exceptionally well, and still stands as being, I've said unique probably more times in this review than I ever should have, but that is what Alan Wake stands out to me. It is a singular title, a unique title, however you would like to phrase it. There's just nothing quite like Wake out there. Yeah, and I really hope I did it justice. So that is the next part of the Remedy series done. I have been debating a lot about whether I should go on to Quantum Break or just continue on to Control. If you made it this far, please let me know if you think I should even bother covering Quantum Break, because I'm just not sure anyone cares. It's really not very good, if I'm going to be entirely honest. But I am really curious to explore it, because the developers talk about how a lot of the concepts for Quantum Break were supposed to be a part of Alan Wake 2, and I think that's maybe really interesting to look at it from that angle, and maybe just entirely break it down and trying to figure out what Alan Wake 2 was at some point supposed to be about. So I don't know, maybe that would be interesting. I'll be working on that I'll deciding that for a couple days, so let me know what you think. And that's it. I'm out.